The story of Yunus AS begins in a place where truth is heavy and patience is tested beyond human limits. He was sent to a nation that had slowly drifted away from guidance, where reminders of Allah were no longer taken seriously, and where hearts had become distracted by pride and routine. Life every day he stood among them, calling them back to truth, warning them about consequences and reminding them of mercy, but his words were often ignored as if they were passing winds that carried no weight. As time continued, the reaction of the people did not improve. Instead, it became more distant and resistant. They began to treat his message as something ordinary, something they could delay or dismiss without concern. This created a growing emotional burden on Yunus AS, because when a messenger sees his people walking toward danger and they refuse to listen, it creates a pressure that cannot be easily described. It is not frustration in a normal sense, but a deep emotional exhaustion that builds slowly over time. Despite the rejection, Yunus AS continued to remain patient. For a long time, he kept delivering the message with sincerity, hoping that one day their hearts would soften and they would return to their creator. But when change did not come and the response remained the same, he began to feel a heavy sense of disappointment, not in the message itself, but in the unwillingness of people to accept what could save them from loss. At a certain point, under this emotional weight, Yunus AS felt that the mission had reached its limit. From his perspective, he believed that the people would not change and that continuing would not bring results, so he made the decision to leave them before receiving clear permission from Allah. This decision was not made out of arrogance, but out of deep emotional exhaustion and a human sense of responsibility that felt overwhelmed by continuous rejection. This moment became the turning point of his journey, because what appeared to be an ending was actually the beginning of a much deeper test that he could not yet understand. Outwardly, it looked like he was leaving his people behind, but in reality, his story was about to enter a phase where patience, faith, and divine wisdom would be tested in a way that would lead him into an experience no human being had ever gone through before. The journey of Yunus AS continues as he boards a ship, leaving behind the people he had spent years guiding. But the moment the vessel moves into open sea, the atmosphere begins to change. Without warning, the calm water turns restless and the sky grows heavy, as if something unseen is approaching. The passengers initially try to continue their journey, but soon realize that this is not an ordinary storm. The waves rise violently and the ship begins to shake with increasing force. Fear spreads among everyone on board, because no sailor can control the direction of the vessel anymore. Every attempt to stabilize the ship fails, and panic slowly replaces confidence. In this moment, people begin to believe that someone among them may be the cause of this unusual disturbance, and desperation starts to take over. Reason to understand the situation, they decide to cast lots, a traditional way of choosing a person when no logical explanation remains available. The process begins with uncertainty and tension filling the air. When the first result appears, it does not point to Yunus AS. But when the process is repeated again, the same name appears, creating confusion among the passengers, because they know he is a respected and honorable person. Even then, hesitation remains, because they cannot believe that someone of his character could be responsible for such a situation. But as the storm grows stronger and the ship becomes more unstable, the casting of lots is repeated until the result continues to point toward Yunus AS. At that moment, the emotional weight becomes unbearable, because truth and confusion collide in a situation that no one fully understands. Yunus AS realizes that this moment is not random and that there is a deeper divine wisdom behind what is happening. Instead of resisting or creating conflict, he remains calm and accepts the situation with silent submission, understanding that sometimes events unfold beyond human reasoning and must be accepted with trust in Allah. As the fear on the ship reaches its peak, a decision is made that will change everything, and what happens next will lead him into a place where no human support or light can reach him. The storm reaches its peak and the sea becomes completely uncontrollable as the ship struggles to survive. The violent waves' fear dominates every heart on board, and the atmosphere turns into pure chaos. In that moment, Yunus AS is taken to the edge of the ship where the final decision is made not out of anger but out of desperation and overwhelming fear of sinking. As he is cast into the open ocean, the surface disappears above him within seconds, and the cold darkness of the sea surrounds him from every direction. There is no land, no ship, and no human voice, only endless water and silence that feels heavier than anything he has ever experienced. This is not just physical danger, but the beginning of a test that goes beyond normal understanding. In the depths of the ocean, something massive begins to move beneath him, a creature so large that it disturbs the water around it without sound or warning. The whale approaches with a force that cannot be resisted, and in a moment that feels frozen in time, Yunus AS is swallowed, completely disappearing into the body of the creature as if the ocean itself has closed over him. Inside the whale, everything changes. Instantly, there is no light, no direction, and no connection to the outside world. The darkness is absolute, and the silence is unlike anything known to human experience. It is a confined space deep beneath the ocean, where survival is no longer about physical strength, but about emotional endurance and spiritual awakening. At this stage, the journey of Yunus AS enters a completely new dimension. What began as a departure from his people has now transformed into an experience of isolation beyond imagination, where every external support is removed and only inner faith remains. And this is where the real test of patience and understanding begins, as he realizes that even in the deepest darkness, he is not beyond the reach of divine control. Inside the belly of the whale, Yunus AS finds himself in a darkness that has no comparison in the human world. It is not just the absence of light, but the absence of direction, sound, and comfort. Everything familiar is gone, and what remains is only silence so heavy that it feels like it is pressing against the heart. In that confined space beneath the ocean, he realizes that he is completely cut off from every form of worldly support. At first, the shock of the situation creates an overwhelming emotional pressure. The mind tries to understand what has happened, how a journey that began with a simple departure has now turned into an existence inside a living creature beneath the sea. Fear begins to rise because there is no visible way out and no human logic that can explain survival in such a condition. This moment represents the peak of human vulnerability, where control is completely removed. As time passes, the emotional state of Yunus AS begins to shift from shock to deep reflection. In the absence of all distractions, he begins to recognize the reality that this is not just a physical confinement, but a divine test that has reached its most intense form. The silence around him becomes a space of realization, where the heart starts turning away from confusion and moving toward understanding. In this isolation, every thought becomes clearer than before. He understands that the situation he is in is not random, but part of a greater wisdom that he cannot yet fully comprehend. The weight of responsibility, the urgency of patience, and the limits of human perception all come together in this moment of complete separation from the world, and he begins to feel that even in this darkness, he is not outside the reach of his creator. Slowly, the fear that once filled his heart begins to transform into awareness. This is not the end of his journey, but a stage of purification where every external layer is removed so that only truth remains. And in this realization, the beginning of spiritual awakening takes place as Yunus AS moves from emotional collapse toward acceptance, understanding that even the deepest darkness can carry a hidden path toward mercy and return. Inside the complete darkness of the whale, Yunus AS reaches a point where no physical strength can help him and no escape is visible. The silence is absolute, and the pressure of isolation becomes so intense that every worldly thought fades away. In this moment, there is only him and the truth of his situation, without distraction or illusion. As the reality settles into his heart, he begins to understand that this is not simply a place of punishment, but a moment of deep reflection where everything he experienced before is Being brought back into awareness, the responsibility of his mission, the emotional weight of his people, and the decision he made to leave all, returned to his mind with clarity that only comes when everything else is stripped away. In this state of complete vulnerability, something powerful begins to rise from within him, not a cry for escape, but a realization of truth. He turns away from blame and turns inward toward recognition of his own limitation. This is where surrender begins, not as defeat, but as understanding that human control was never absolute and that true power belongs only to Allah. From the depths of that darkness, a dua emerges, simple yet powerful: La ilaha illa anta, subhanaka inni kuntu minaz zalimin. This is not just a statement, it is a complete shift in consciousness, a moment where ego disappears and acceptance takes its place. It carries acknowledgement of truth, glorification of the Creator, and recognition of personal limitation, all in one breath. As this dua is repeated, the emotional weight inside the well begins to transform. The darkness remains physically unchanged, but internally something has shifted. Fear begins to dissolve and awareness begins to grow. This is the point where spiritual awakening replaces emotional collapse, and where the heart that was once overwhelmed now finds peace in surrender. In this moment, Yunus AS experiences the deepest form of connection, not through escape from difficulty, but through acceptance within it. And this realization becomes the foundation of what is to come next. Because when surrender becomes complete, the path toward mercy and relief begins to open, even in the most impossible of circumstances. Inside the whale, Yunus AS enters a reality that no human experience can fully describe. It is not just confinement, it is existence inside complete isolation, beneath layers of ocean pressure where light cannot reach, and silence feels alive. In this space, there is no direction, no movement, and no external sign of life, yet he is still alive and aware. At first, the mind struggles to accept what is happening because survival inside such a condition seems beyond logic, but slowly something unusual begins to settle within him. Instead of focusing on the impossibility of escape, he begins to focus on understanding the meaning behind the situation. Every second becomes a moment of reflection where external life no longer matters and only internal truth remains. Time in this state loses its normal meaning. There are no days, no nights, only continuous awareness. Inside darkness, but in this stillness, something hidden begins to develop: strength of heart, clarity of thought, and a deeper connection with his Creator. The absence of everything becomes the space where everything inside him is restructured. Faith becomes stronger, not because conditions improve, but because dependence on everything else is removed. In this impossible prison, there are no distractions, only direct confrontation with reality. Thoughts that were once scattered now become focused, and heavy questions about life, mission, responsibility, and divine wisdom all return with intensity. Yet, instead of breaking him, they begin to refine him, slowly transforming emotional pressure into spiritual awakening. And even though no one from the outside can see what is happening inside the whale, a hidden miracle is unfolding within his state of being. He is no longer reacting to fear, but responding with understanding. Every moment of silence becomes a lesson in trust. Every breath becomes a reminder that control was never in human hands. And this realization begins to reshape his entire perception of existence. This stage of the journey shows that imprisonment is not always physical. Sometimes it is the stripping away of everything familiar so that only truth remains. And in this absolute isolation, Yunus AS discovers a level of faith that cannot be built in comfort, but only in complete surrender, where even the impossible becomes a place of spiritual growth. Inside the depths of darkness, where no human voice can reach and no light can enter, Yunus AS remains in complete isolation. But what he does not see is that his condition has already reached the point where divine mercy is about to respond in a way beyond human expectation. The same silence that once felt endless is now at the center of a command that will change everything. At a moment known only to Allah, the order is given, and the situation that seemed permanent begins to shift. The whale that had carried him through the ocean is now commanded to release him. This is not a gradual change but a decisive turning point where what was holding him becomes the means of his return and the impossible begins to reverse itself as Yunus AS is released from the darkness of the whale. He moves through layers of water that once represented complete isolation, but now they become pathways toward light for the first time since entering this trial. He experiences movement that is not trapped, but guided upward. The pressure of darkness begins to fade, and the weight that once surrounded him starts to dissolve. When he finally reaches the surface, light breaks through in a way that feels completely new. It is not just physical light, but emotional rebirth. The same world that once felt closed is now open again, and the same existence that once felt like punishment now carries the meaning of mercy. He realizes that what he endured was not abandonment, but a process that brought him back with deeper awareness and stronger faith. At this stage, Yunus AS is not the same person who entered the sea or the same person who spoke in frustration. Before leaving his people, he has been transformed through isolation, reflection, and surrender. The experience inside the whale has reshaped his understanding of patience, responsibility, and divine timing, and now every breath feels like a second chance. And as he returns toward land, a new chapter quietly begins, one where healing replaces hardship and understanding replaces confusion. Because when divine command intervenes, even the deepest darkness can turn into the clearest path back toward light. After emerging from the overwhelming darkness of the sea, Yunus AS does not return in a state of strength, but in complete physical exhaustion. His body is weak, his energy is drained, and the experience he has just gone through leaves both physical and emotional impact that cannot be ignored. This is not a return of power, but a return of vulnerability, where even basic survival feels heavy. In this state of weakness, he is placed under divine care and mercy, as Allah provides him with shelter and protection from the harsh environment around him. A tree is made a source of shade and comfort where he can rest away from the intensity of the outside world. This moment reflects that after the deepest trials comes the gentlest form of mercy, not in grand display, but in quiet support that restores life slowly. As he rests under this shelter, his body begins to recover gradually. The exhaustion that once overwhelmed him starts to fade and his strength begins to return step by step. But more important than physical recovery is the emotional healing taking place inside him. The heart that experienced fear, isolation, and realization now begins to settle into a state of calm understanding. During this time, reflection becomes his companion. Every moment of suffering he experienced inside the whale, and before it begins to form a complete picture in his mind, he understands that what seemed like separation from mercy was actually a journey within mercy itself. Every stage of hardship was leading toward restoration, not destruction. Slowly, hope begins to return, not as sudden emotion, but as steady awareness that Allah's mercy has always been present even when it was not visible. The tree shade becomes a symbol of protection, reminding him that divine care often arrives in the simplest forms at the moment when it is needed most. At this stage, Yunus AS is not only recovering physically, but also being emotionally and spiritually rebuilt. The weight of the past does not disappear instantly, but it transforms into understanding and gratitude. And in this calm recovery phase, he prepares himself for what comes next, because every return from hardship carries a responsibility, and his journey is not yet complete. After recovery and restoration, Yunus AS is guided back toward the very people he once left behind. But this return is not like the departure that once happened in frustration. Now, everything carries a deeper sense of understanding, because both the messenger and the people have been changed by time and experience. What once was separation is now becoming a chance for correction. When he approaches his nation, something unexpected happens. The same people who once rejected his message are no longer in the same state. Their hearts have gone through realization and reflection. They have seen consequences and understood that the warnings of Yunus AS were not empty words, but truth they can no longer ignore. This awareness creates a shift in their behavior and emotional state. As Yunus AS returns, there is no arrogance, no blame, and no pride. Instead, there is a quiet emotional atmosphere where both sides are aware of the past, but also aware that a new beginning is possible. The people begin to turn back toward repentance, acknowledging their mistakes and seeking forgiveness. This moment reflects one of the most powerful transformations in human behavior when regret leads to change. Instead of denial, the reunion between Yunus AS and his people is not dramatic in the sense of conflict, but deeply emotional in the sense of understanding. What was once resistance now becomes acceptance, and what was once distance now becomes reconnection. The message that was ignored before is now embraced with sincerity and awareness. In this renewed connection, Yunus AS resumes his role not as someone broken by rejection, but as someone strengthened by experience. His leadership is no longer just about warning, but about guiding with wisdom that comes from hardship. He understands both patience and timing, and this makes his message even more impactful because it is now supported by lived experience. This stage of the story shows that second chances are possible when hearts become willing to change, and that guidance is most powerful when it is finally accepted after realization. And the return of Yunus AS becomes a symbol that no matter how far someone has gone away from truth, there is always a path back when sincerity returns to the heart. The journey of Yunus AS does not end with survival or return. It ends with understanding that every moment he lived through was never random. The departure, the storm, the sea, the whale, and the darkness were all parts of a process that revealed something far deeper than events themselves. Everything was connected to a divine system of timing, wisdom, and unseen planning that the human mind only understands in reflection. When you look at his story from beginning to end, a pattern becomes clear that human emotion often reacts quickly, but divine timing unfolds perfectly. What looked like frustration in Yunus AS was actually a moment of human limitation, and what looked like punishment was actually correction and realignment. Every stage of his journey was shaping him, not breaking him. One of the strongest lessons from this story is patience under pressure. True patience is not silence without feeling, it is control during emotional intensity. Yunus AS experienced moments where any human would feel overwhelmed, yet his journey teaches that even in the deepest uncertainty, there is a space where faith can remain steady, and that space becomes the source of strength. Another lesson is the power of repentance and return. No matter how far a person goes or how deep the situation becomes, the door back to mercy is never closed. The dua of Yunus AS became a symbol of complete surrender, recognition of truth, and acceptance of limitation. It shows that when ego ends, connection begins, and when surrender begins, healing starts. The story also reveals that divine timing is never late. What feels delayed to humans is often perfectly positioned in wisdom. The whale was not an end, it was a transformation chamber where awareness replaced confusion and clarity replaced fear. This changes the way we understand hardship because difficulty is not always destruction. Sometimes it is preparation for elevation. Emotionally, this journey transforms the audience because it shifts perception from despair to hope, from confusion to trust, and from fear to understanding. It teaches that life is not defined by where you fall, but by how you respond when you are in darkness and how you rise when light returns. The final message is simple yet powerful. No situation is permanent, no darkness is final, and no mistake is beyond return. Just as Yunus AS moved from silence to storm to darkness and back to light, every human life carries the possibility of return, transformation, and mercy. And the question that remains is not what happened to him, but what will you do when your own moment of darkness arrives?